Some men spend their lives building empires, only to realize too late what they've lost along the way. Silas Dunn made his fortune buying bankrupt ranches and flipping the land to developers, but wealth couldn't silence the regret. Now, 73, and widowed, he rides the frontier alone, trying to outrun ghosts that won't let him rest. When a violent storm destroys a remote homestead, he discovers an elderly couple standing helplessly in the ruins of their life's work. Ruth and Emmett built that home with their bare hands. Now it's gone. Most would ride past, but something in Ruth's face and how Emmett refuses to release her hand stops him cold. Could helping them rebuild, somehow rebuild the man he used to be? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun broke across the Montana prairie like a promise, casting long shadows that stretched toward the distant mountains. Silas Dunn sat astride his buckskin mare, watching the light paint the grassland in shades of gold and amber. At 73, he'd learned to appreciate such moments, the kind that cost nothing but gave everything. His younger self wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have noticed. That man had been too busy calculating acreage and profit margins to see beauty in anything that couldn't be bought or sold. The mare shifted beneath him, patient as always. Her name was Patience, actually, a fact that made Silas smile every time he thought about it. His late wife Clara had named her, back when the horse was just a yearling and Silas was still learning what it meant to slow down. That had been 8 years ago, before the cancer took Clara, before the silence in his 12-room house became so loud he couldn't stand to be inside it anymore. He carried little these days. A bedroll tied behind the saddle, a worn leather saddlebag with jerky, coffee, and a tin cup. The Winchester rifle in its scabbard, more for show than necessity, though he still knew how to use it, and in his shirt pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, a photograph of Clara on their wedding day. She'd been 22, wearing a simple white dress her mother had sewn. He'd been 25 and convinced he could conquer the world. He had conquered it in a way, just not the way that mattered. The Dunn Ranch, what remained of it, sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Montana rangeland. He'd built it from nothing, starting with a single parcel he'd bought at auction when the previous owner went bankrupt. That had been in 1978. He still remembered the man's face, how he'd wept openly when the gavel came down. Silas had felt something then, a twinge, maybe guilt, but he'd pushed it down. Business was business. The land would be better managed under his stewardship. That's what he'd told himself anyway. Over the next 30 years, Silas had acquired 43 ranches, some through legitimate purchases, others through more creative means, finding legal loopholes, exploiting debts, occasionally greasing the right palms in the county assessor's office. He'd never broken the law, not technically, but he'd bent it so far it nearly snapped. And with each acquisition, he told himself the same thing. These people weren't cut out for ranching. They'd have lost their land eventually. He was just speeding up the inevitable. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd accumulated all that land, all that wealth, only to discover he didn't want it anymore. Most of it he'd sold off or donated to conservation trusts. Some he'd returned to families he'd bought it from, quietly and without fanfare. The lawyers had thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But Clara's death had done something to him, cracked him open in a way that let the light in, or maybe let the darkness out. He wasn't sure which. These days he rode the frontier like a man searching for something he'd lost but couldn't name. He'd visit small towns, help out where he could. Last month, he'd spent 2 weeks in Absaroki, helping the Rodriguez family repair their barn after a tree fell through the roof. The month before, he'd been in Red Lodge, teaching a young widow how to manage her books so the bank couldn't take her feed store. Small things, quiet things, the kind of things that didn't make headlines or pad bank accounts, the kind of things that let him sleep at night. He clicked his tongue, and Patience started forward, her hooves making soft sounds in the prairie grass. They were heading east, toward nothing in particular. Silas had learned not to plan too far ahead. The frontier had a way of presenting opportunities to those who paid attention. Clara used to say that God worked in mysterious ways. Silas wasn't sure about God anymore. He'd traded away too much to maintain that kind of faith, but he believed in the mysterious part. Life had patterns, if you knew how to read them. The storm had blown through 3 days ago. Silas had waited it out in a line shack near Billings, listening to the wind howl and the rain hammer the roof. It had been the kind of storm that made you grateful for walls and a roof, the kind that reminded you how small you were in the face of nature's fury. When it passed, he'd emerged to find the landscape transformed, trees down, creeks swollen to rivers, the very earth torn and reshaped by wind and water. Now, as he rode, he saw the aftermath everywhere. Fences knocked flat, debris scattered across the grassland like forgotten toys. In the distance, a windmill stood at a crooked angle, its blades bent and useless. The storm had been thorough in its destruction, careless in its power. It made him think of himself, of the path he'd cut through the ranching community all those years ago. He'd been a storm too in his way, just slower, more deliberate. Patience crested a low rise, and Silas saw smoke on the horizon. Not the black smoke of a wildfire, but the thin grey column of a controlled burn. Probably someone clearing debris. He adjusted his course toward it, curious. In country this remote, neighbors helped neighbors. It was an unwritten rule, old as the land itself. The kind of rule Silas had forgotten in his years of acquisition, but was slowly relearning now. As he drew closer, he could make out structures, or what had been structures. A homestead by the look of it, the kind that spoke of decades of careful stewardship. The main house had been a simple affair, probably 2 bedrooms, wood siding painted white. Past tense, because now the roof had collapsed entirely, caving in the north wall and crushing everything beneath it. A barn stood nearby, or most of one, its western face torn away as if a giant hand had simply scooped it out. Fencing lay in twisted heaps. A chicken coop had been reduced to kindling, and in the center of it all 2 figures stood motionless, staring at the wreckage. Silas reined in patience and sat for a moment, taking in the scene. The couple, elderly, he could tell even from this distance, stood close together, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders. They weren't moving, weren't speaking, just standing there, bearing witness to the destruction of their world. He recognized that stance, the weight of it, the way grief and shock made you still, made you small. He'd stood exactly that way when the doctor told him about Clara's prognosis. When nothing in your body works right, because your mind can't process what it's seeing, for a long moment, Silas considered riding on. This wasn't his business. These people didn't know him, wouldn't want his help. They certainly wouldn't want his money, not if they knew where it came from. He'd learned that the hard way over the past few years. Some people would rather struggle with dignity than accept help from a man with his reputation. But something held him there. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the woman's hair, white and long, gathered in a braid like Clara used to wear. Maybe it was how the man held her, protective and tender, his free hand grasping hers like he was afraid she might blow away with the next gust of wind. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the knowledge that he could help, and therefore should. He nudged Patience forward, approaching slowly so as not to startle them. As he drew near, the man turned, alert but not alarmed, his weathered face set in lines that suggested a lifetime of hard work and honest living. He was probably in his mid-70s, built lean and strong, wearing work clothes that had seen better days but were clean and mended with care. The woman turned more slowly, and Silas felt something catch in his chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there were no tears. Just a kind of stunned emptiness that was somehow worse than crying. "Morning," Silas called, keeping his voice level and respectful. He stopped Patience a polite distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Silas Dunn. I was passing through and saw your trouble here. That storm was a mean one." The man studied him for a moment, taking his measure the way country folk do. Not hostile, just careful. Then he nodded once. "Emmett Walsh, this here's my wife, Ruth." His voice was steady, but Silas heard the tremor underneath, the kind you got when you were holding yourself together by force of will, alone. "Pleased to meet you both," Silas said. He dismounted slowly, giving them time to adjust to his presence, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Ruth spoke for the first time, her voice soft and rough at once, like worn velvet. "We built that house ourselves, 47 years ago. Emmett cut every board. I sewed the curtains for every window." She wasn't looking at Silas. She was looking at the ruins, seeing something he couldn't, seeing it whole and standing, seeing their life as it had been before the storm decided otherwise. "I can see it was built with care," Silas said quietly. And he could. Even in its destruction, the craftsmanship was evident. The way the remaining walls stood plumb, the quality of the materials, the little details that spoke of pride and patience. This hadn't been a house thrown together quickly. It had been a home, built slowly and with love. Emmett cleared his throat. "Insurance lapsed 3 months back. We had to choose between that and Ruth's medicine. Wasn't much of a choice." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but the words landed heavy nonetheless. Silas knew that choice. He'd seen it made 100 times in the communities he'd passed through. Good people forced to decide between security tomorrow and survival today. The kind of choice that shouldn't exist in a just world, but did anyway. "Well," Silas said, looking around at the wreckage, then back at the couple, "I've got time and 2 good hands. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you rebuild." Emmett frowned slightly. "Mister, we can't pay you—" "Didn't ask you to," Silas interrupted gently. "I've got more money than I need and more time than I know what to do with. Sometimes the best way to spend both is helping folks who need it." Ruth looked at him directly for the first time, really looked at him, and Silas felt something shift in the air between them. Her eyes were hazel, sharp despite the grief, and they seemed to see right through to whatever was left of his soul. "Why?" she asked simply. It was a fair question. Silas considered it. Standing there in the morning sun, with the wreckage all around them, and these 2 strangers watching him with careful hope. He could have lied, could have offered some easy platitude about Christian charity or frontier hospitality, but Ruth's eyes wouldn't let him. "They demanded truth, because I spent most of my life taking," he said finally. "I'd like to spend what's left of it giving back. If you'll let me." The silence that followed was weighted with consideration. Emmett and Ruth exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless communication that comes from decades of marriage, where entire conversations happen in the space of a heartbeat. Then Emmett nodded slowly. "All right then, Mr. Dunn, we'd be grateful for the help." Silas felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for longer than he cared to admit. He extended his hand, and Emmett took it, his grip firm and calloused, the handshake of a man who'd worked with his hands all his life. Then Ruth stepped forward and took Silas's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said softly, and in her eyes Silas saw something he hadn't seen in his own reflection for a very long time, the possibility of redemption. They started with the barn. Emmett insisted on it, practical to his bones. The animals needed shelter first, he said, before any thought was given to human comfort. Silas agreed without argument. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't help people by overruling their priorities. You helped by supporting what they already knew needed doing. The barn's eastern wall and roof remained mostly intact, which meant they had a foundation to work from. The western face would need to be entirely rebuilt, and the loft had suffered water damage, but the bones were good. Silas could see that Emmett had built this structure the same way he'd built his house, carefully, deliberately, with an eye toward longevity rather than speed. They worked through the morning, the 3 of them, clearing debris and sorting salvageable lumber from kindling. Ruth proved as capable as any ranch hand Silas had ever employed, carrying loads that would have shamed men half her age. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime doing hard work, her movements economical and sure. Emmett watched her constantly, Silas noticed, not hovering exactly, but keeping track, as if afraid she might suddenly disappear if he looked away too long. Around noon, Ruth excused herself to make lunch. She'd set up a makeshift kitchen in the one outbuilding that had survived the storm intact, a small equipment shed that now served as their temporary living quarters. Silas watched her go, saw the careful way she stepped over the debris, and felt that familiar ache in his chest. Clara had moved the same way after her diagnosis, like she was negotiating with gravity itself. "She's stronger than she looks," Emmett said quietly, following Silas's gaze. "Always has been. I can see that." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of timber and the distant call of a hawk. Then Emmett straightened, wiping his brow with a faded bandana. "You said you used to ranch. What made you stop?" Silas set down the board he'd been carrying and considered the question. The truth was complicated, layered with regret and realization. But Emmett deserved honesty, especially if they were going to work together. "Lost my way for a while," Silas said finally. "Spent 30 years building an empire, only to realize I'd built it on other people's heartbreak. When my wife passed 8 years back, it made me take a hard look at the man I'd become. Didn't much care for what I saw." Emmett nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And now? Now I'm trying to balance the scales? Probably can't, probably shouldn't even try. But I have to do something with what's left of my time. Ruth says everyone deserves a chance to make things right," Emmett said. "I believe her. She's usually right about people." They returned to work, the conversations settling between them like an understanding. By early afternoon, they'd cleared enough space to begin actual reconstruction. Emmett proved to be an excellent carpenter, his hands sure despite their age, his eye for measurement exact. They fell into an easy rhythm, Silas following Emmett's lead, learning the particular way this man worked. Ruth brought them water around 3, along with sandwiches wrapped in cloth. As Silas reached for his, he noticed something clutched in her other hand, a small wooden box, maybe 6 inches square. Its surface water-stained, but otherwise intact. "Found this in the house rubble," she said softly, her voice carrying an emotion Silas couldn't quite name. "Thought it was lost." Emmett's face changed when he saw it. His weathered features softened, and something that might have been tears gathered in his eyes. "You found it. It was under the bureau. Must have been protected when everything came down." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she held the box. "I can't believe it survived." Silas felt like an intruder suddenly, witnessing something private and profound. He started to excuse himself, but Ruth looked up at him. "Our daughter made this," she said, opening the lid carefully. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a collection of small items: a lock of baby hair tied with ribbon, a tarnished silver spoon, a tiny knitted bootie, yellowed photographs, and a folded piece of paper. "Rebecca. She passed when she was 7. Scarlet fever." The words landed like stones in still water rippling outward. Silas felt the weight of them, the old grief that never quite healed, just scarred over. "I'm sorry," he said, inadequate as the words were. 39 years ago this November," Emmett said quietly. "Feels like yesterday, and a lifetime ago all at once." Ruth lifted out the folded paper with careful fingers and opened it. The crayon drawing was still visible, though faded. A child's rendering of a house and 2 stick figures holding hands, a yellow sun in the corner, a brown horse off to one side. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, "Mama and Daddy, I love you, Rebecca." "She drew this the week before she got sick," Ruth whispered. "Said it was our family. Said she wanted us to keep it forever, so we'd always remember how happy we were." Her voice broke on the last word. And Emmett pulled her close, his own face crumbling. Silas stood there, his hands hanging useless at his sides, and felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd lost Clara, but they'd had 46 years together. They'd had time to say goodbye, time to hold hands and make peace with the ending. These people had lost their child, their only child, he realized with sudden certainty, when she was barely old enough to write her own name. And yet they'd stayed. They'd built a life together in the shadow of that loss, had kept going when everything in them must have screamed to stop. The box wasn't just a collection of mementos. It was proof. Proof that they'd survived the unsurvivable. Proof that love persisted even when its object was gone. Proof that some things were worth preserving no matter the cost. "The house can be replaced," Ruth said after a long moment, carefully returning the drawing to the box and closing the lid. "The barn can be rebuilt. But this," she held the box against her chest, "this is all we have left of her. If the storm had taken this too, I don't know if I could—" She stopped, unable to finish. Silas understood then. The house wasn't just wood and nails. The barn wasn't just shelter for animals. This homestead was the last place their daughter had lived, had laughed, had drawn pictures of her family. Every board Emmett had cut, every nail Ruth had held steady, had been touched by Rebecca's small hands at some point. To lose it all would have been like losing her again. "Then we'll make sure it stands twice as strong," Silas heard himself say. "We'll rebuild it so it can weather any storm. So it's here for as long as you need it to be." Emmett looked at him, and Silas saw gratitude there, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that they were both men carrying loss, both trying to find meaning in what remained. "Thank you," Emmett said simply. They stood there in the afternoon sun. Three people bound together by grief and circumstance, by the basic human need to build something that would last. And Silas realized that this was why he'd stopped, why he couldn't just ride past. It wasn't about the rebuilding, not really. It was about bearing witness, about acknowledging that what had been lost here, the house, the barn, and long before that, the child who'd made it a home, mattered. That it deserved to be honored, to be remembered, to be restored. He thought of all the ranches he'd acquired over the years, all the families he'd displaced. How many of them had their own boxes of memories? How many children's drawings had been packed away in haste, if they'd been saved at all? How many lives had he disrupted in his single-minded pursuit of wealth and expansion? The weight of it settled on him like physical pressure, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. But then Ruth reached out and touched his arm, her hand light but steady. "The past is done," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "All we can do is choose better going forward." Silas looked at her, at this woman who'd lost everything that mattered, and yet somehow still had grace enough to offer comfort to a stranger, and felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, might never deserve it, but maybe the beginning of acceptance, the acknowledgement that he couldn't undo what he'd done, but he could do better now. He could choose, as Ruth said, to go forward differently. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, we can." They returned to work as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, and Silas felt the weight of his past settling into something he could carry. Not easily, not without pain, but carry it he would, one board at a time, one nail driven true, until something good emerged from all the wreckage, both theirs and his own. The work fell into a pattern over the next 3 days. They rose with the sun, worked through the morning, took lunch in the shade of what remained of the barn, then pushed through until the light failed. Silas had forgotten how satisfying physical labor could be, the ache in his muscles, the simple pleasure of seeing progress measured in tangible increments. By the end of the 3rd day, they'd framed out the western wall and begun work on the roof supports, but patterns, Silas knew, had a way of revealing what lay beneath them. And what lay beneath this particular pattern was worry. It started small. Emmett pausing mid-swing with the hammer, his face going distant for a moment before he caught himself and continued. Ruth moving more slowly in the afternoons, her breathing slightly labored when she thought no one was watching. The way they looked at the pile of salvaged lumber, then at the house ruins, then at each other with expressions that carried more weight than words ever could. On the 4th morning, Silas arrived at the homestead to find Emmett sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at a piece of paper in his hands. Ruth stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, her face set in lines of quiet determination. "Morning," Silas called, keeping his voice light, but something in their posture made him cautious. Emmett looked up, and Silas saw exhaustion in his eyes, not the physical kind that came from hard work, but the deeper weariness of impossible choices. "Morning, Silas." He held up the paper. Letter came from the county assessor's office. They're saying the property's not in compliance anymore. House uninhabitable, barn damaged beyond... He stopped, his jaw working. They're giving us 30 days to bring everything up to code, or they'll condemn the whole property. The words hung in the air like smoke. Silas felt anger spark in his chest, the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that crushed people who were already down. 30 days, he repeated. That's not enough time. No, Emmett agreed quietly. It's not. Ruth's hand tightened on her husband's shoulder. We'll figure something out. We always do. But Silas heard the tremor beneath her words, saw the way her fingers whitened with the grip. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of the ranchers whose land he'd acquired. The desperate hope that maybe, somehow, things would work out, even when all evidence pointed to the contrary. What's the code requirement? Silas asked, his mind already working through possibilities. Emmett handed him the letter. Silas scanned it, his experienced eye picking out the key phrases. Structural integrity report. Licensed contractor. Electrical and plumbing inspection. Occupancy permit. Each requirement another hurdle, another expense, another barrier between these people and their home. It's the contractor, that's the problem, Emmett said. We can do the work ourselves, have been doing it. But the county won't sign off without a licensed contractor's stamp. And the nearest one who'd take on a job this small is in Billings. Even if we could afford him, which we can't, he's booked 3 months out. Silas folded the letter carefully, buying himself a moment to think. He had the resources to solve this problem easily. Could hire a crew, fly in specialists, throw money at it, until the bureaucracy backed down. But he'd learned over the past few years that sometimes help given too freely created its own kind of debt, one that weighed heavier than money ever could. I know a contractor, he said finally. Fellow named Jack Morrison. Works out of Red Lodge. Owes me a favor. Emmett's expression tightened. Silas, we can't... You're not asking, Silas interrupted gently. I'm offering. And it's not charity. Jack really does owe me a favor. I helped his daughter get into a good nursing program last year. He's been looking for a way to pay me back. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. Jack did owe him in a sense. More importantly, Jack was a good man who'd understand what Silas was trying to do here, and would play along without making Emmett and Ruth feel like recipients of pity. Ruth and Emmett exchanged another of their silent conversations. Finally, Ruth nodded slightly, and Emmett let out a long breath. We'd be grateful, he said, if it's really no trouble at all. Silas pulled out his phone, one of the few modern conveniences he'd kept, and walked a short distance away to make the call. Jack answered on the second ring, and Silas explained the situation in low tones. To his credit, Jack didn't ask questions about why Silas was helping strangers rebuild a barn. He just said he'd clear his schedule and be there in 2 days. When Silas returned, he found Ruth had gone inside the equipment shed. Through the small window, he could see her sitting on the narrow cot they'd set up as a bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Emmett stood outside, his back to the shed, giving her privacy but clearly torn about it. She tries to be strong, Emmett said without turning around. But it's wearing on her. The medicine helps, but... He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. She has good days and bad days. This is a bad one. Silas remembered those days with Clara, the ones where the weight of illness and uncertainty became too much to carry gracefully, where the mask slipped and the fear showed through. What does she have? He asked quietly. Heart condition. Congestive heart failure, they call it. Had it 5 years now. The medicine keeps it stable mostly, but stress makes it worse. Emmett's voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands were clenched at his sides. Losing the house, dealing with this county nonsense, worrying about where we'll go if they condemn the property. It's all hitting her harder than she lets on. Understanding clicked into place for Silas. This wasn't just about rebuilding a home. It was about preserving Ruth's health, about giving her a reason to keep fighting. The homestead was her anchor, the place where her daughter had lived and died, the place where her memories dwelt. To lose it would be more than displacement. It would be a kind of death in itself. Then we'll make sure she doesn't lose it, Silas said firmly. Jack will get here day after tomorrow. We'll work twice as hard until then, get as much done as we can. Between the three of us and a licensed contractor, we'll meet that 30-day deadline. Emmett finally turned to face him, and Silas saw tears tracking down the older man's weathered face. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Really doing it? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." It was the same question Ruth had asked that first day, and Silas still didn't have a perfect answer. But he had a true one. "Because I spent my life taking homes from people," he said simply, "and I can't undo that. But I can make sure you keep yours." Emmett held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He extended his hand, and Silas took it. The handshake was brief but firm, sealing an understanding that went deeper than words. That afternoon, they worked with renewed purpose. Ruth emerged from the shed, red-eyed but composed, and threw herself back into the labor with determined intensity. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, punctuated by the sounds of construction. Hammer on nail, saw through wood. The creak and shift of timber finding its place. As the sun began to set, Silas stood back and surveyed their progress. The barn was taking shape, its western wall now fully framed, the roof supports strong and true. It wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but it was no longer ruins. It was becoming something again. And maybe, Silas thought as he gathered his tools for the evening, he was too. Jack Morrison arrived exactly when he said he would, pulling up in a dusty pickup truck with his tools rattling in the bed. He was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s, with hands like sledgehammers and a face that had seen its share of Montana weather. When he climbed out of the truck, he surveyed the property with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime assessing structural damage. "Well," he said after a long moment, "you weren't exaggerating." Silas made the introductions, watching carefully as Jack shook hands with Emmett and Ruth. To his relief, Jack treated them with straightforward respect, no pity, no judgment, just the professional courtesy of one craftsman to another. "I've looked over the county requirements," Jack said, pulling a clipboard from his truck. "Most of it's standard stuff. The real issue is going to be the electrical. That old wiring in the house, what's left of it, isn't going to pass any modern inspection. We'll need to run new lines throughout." Emmett's face fell slightly. "How much are we talking?" Jack glanced at Silas, a question in his eyes. Silas gave a small shake of his head. "Let them maintain their dignity." Jack caught it and nodded imperceptibly. "Tell you what," he said, turning back to Emmett. "I've got a whole spool of wire sitting in my shop that's been there for 2 years. Bought it for a job that fell through. It's just taking up space. And I've been meaning to teach my apprentice proper residential wiring anyway. You'd be doing me a favor letting us practice here." It was smoothly done, Silas had to admit. Emmett looked skeptical, but Ruth touched his arm gently. "We'd appreciate that," she said. "And maybe I could send some meals home with you for your trouble? I've been told my pot roast is worth the drive." Jack's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Ma'am, if it's half as good as what I'm smelling from that shed right now, you've got yourself a deal." They spent the rest of that day working in coordinated effort. Jack proved to be not just skilled, but patient, taking time to explain what he was doing and why, treating Emmett and Ruth as collaborators rather than clients. By evening, they'd made significant progress on both the barn and laid the groundwork for tackling the house reconstruction. That night, as Silas was preparing to ride back to his camp, Jack pulled him aside. "That's a good couple," he said quietly. "Remind me of my own folks. Dad built their house the same way, board by board, year by year. They're good people," Silas agreed, "and you're doing a good thing here." Jack studied him in the fading light. "I heard stories about you back in the day. Some weren't too flattering." Silas met his gaze steadily. "Probably all true, maybe so. But a man who's trying to make things right, that counts for something." Jack extended his hand. "I'll be back tomorrow morning." "And Silas, the wire really has been sitting in my shop for 2 years. This isn't charity. It's good business, getting rid of old inventory and training my apprentice. So don't go thinking you're putting me out." Silas shook his hand, grateful for the understanding. "Appreciate that, Jack." The work continued over the following days, falling into a new rhythm with Jack's presence. His apprentice, a quiet young man named Daniel, arrived on the third day, and together they began the painstaking process of rewiring what would become the new house. Emmett and Silas focused on the barn, which was nearing completion, while Ruth managed the logistics, keeping everyone fed and supplied with water and materials as needed. But on the sixth day, something shifted. Silas arrived at the homestead to find a strange truck parked near the ruins, a newer model, expensive, with county plates. A man in pressed slacks and a button-down shirt stood talking to Emmett, holding a folder and gesturing at the property. Ruth stood nearby, her arms crossed, her face set in hard lines. As Silas approached, he caught the tail end of the conversation. "Simply not feasible within the time frame," the county man was saying. "I've reviewed your progress, and while it's admirable, you're not going to meet code requirements in—" he checked his watch— 23 days. The most practical solution would be to accept the county's offer to purchase the property. "It's actually quite generous, given the condition. We're not selling," Ruth said flatly. The county man sighed like he'd expected this response and found it tedious. "Mrs. Walsh, please understand that I'm trying to help you here. The property is in violation. If you don't bring it up to code, we'll have no choice but to condemn it. Then you'll have nothing. Whereas if you sell now, how much is the county offering?" Silas interrupted, his voice calm, but carrying an edge. The county man turned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Silas Dunn. I'm helping with the reconstruction." Something flickered in the county man's eyes, recognition maybe, or calculation. "Mr. Dunn, yes, I've heard of you." He straightened his shoulders slightly. "The county is offering fair market value for undeveloped land in this area." 63,000. Silas felt his jaw tighten. He knew land values around here. Even with the damage, this property was worth triple that, easily. The location alone, with access to water and mountain views, made it valuable. Someone wanted this land, and they were using bureaucratic pressure to get it cheap. "And what does the county plan to do with the property?" Silas asked. "That's not really relevant to—" "Humor me." The county man's expression hardened. "There's been interest from a development company. They're looking to build a resort complex. High-end lodging, recreation facilities. It would be good for the local economy." There it was. Silas knew this playbook because he'd written parts of it himself years ago. Find vulnerable property owners, use legal pressure to force a sale, flip it to developers for 10 times what you paid. He'd done it dozens of times, always telling himself it was just business. Now, standing here watching someone try to do the same thing to Emmett and Ruth. "He felt sick, Mr. Walsh," Silas said quietly. "What's the county code say about timeline extensions for properties affected by natural disasters?" Emmett blinked. I'm not sure." The county man's expression tightened. "That's not applicable here." "Actually," Jack's voice came from behind them. "It is." He walked over, wiping his hands on a rag, his face pleasant, but his eyes hard. "Montana Statute 76-3504 allows for reasonable extensions when property damage results from acts of God. Storm like that one qualifies. They're entitled to at least 90 days from initial notice, possibly more, if they can show good faith progress." The county man's face reddened. "I'll need to verify—" "You do that," Jack said. "And while you're at it, you might want to verify that the assessment notice was properly filed, because I'm not seeing any record of it at the county clerk's office, which would make this whole conversation premature." Silas watched the county man's face go through several shades of red as he realized he'd overplayed his hand. The man gathered his folder, muttered something about following up later, and retreated to his truck with whatever dignity he could salvage. As the truck disappeared down the road, Emmett let out a long breath. "That statute, is that real?" "Real as rain," Jack confirmed. "And he knew it, which is why he backed down so fast. Someone's trying to pressure you into selling. They figured an elderly couple wouldn't know their rights." Ruth's hand found Emmett's. "Thank you," she said to both Jack and Silas. "Both of you." Silas looked at the ruins, at the half-built barn, at these two people who'd already lost so much and were being pressured to lose more. And he felt something crystallize inside him, not just the desire to help, but the determination to make sure they couldn't be pushed off their land. "We're going to finish this," he said.
All of it.
"House, barn, everything. Up to code and beyond. And we're going to do it in time?" Emmett studied him. "That's a tall order." "Yes," Silas agreed. "It is. But I've got some calls to make." The calls Silas made that evening set things in motion. By the next morning, 2 additional workers arrived. Men Silas had helped over the years who were eager to return the favor. By noon, a lumber delivery showed up, courtesy of a supplier in Billings who owed Silas for a loan he'd forgiven during the recession. Materials appeared as if by magic: roofing shingles, electrical fixtures, plumbing supplies, even windows sized exactly right for the house plans Emmett had drawn up decades ago. Emmett watched it all with growing discomfort. That evening, after the workers had left, he confronted Silas as he was saddling patience for the ride back to camp. "This is too much," Emmett said, his voice tight. "We agreed to help, not this." He gestured at the stacks of materials, at the newly completed barn that now stood straight and solid. "We can't repay this, Silas. Even if we wanted to sell, the land wouldn't cover it." Silas paused, his hands on the saddle. He'd expected this conversation, had been dreading it. "Nobody's asking you to repay anything. That's the problem." Emmett's weathered face was troubled. "A man's supposed to stand on his own, pay his own way. What you're doing, it's generous, don't get me wrong. But it's also," he struggled for the word, "it's taking something from us. Our independence, I guess." Silas turned to face him fully. The evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the property. In the distance, he could see Ruth moving around in the equipment shed, probably preparing dinner. "You want to know the truth?" he asked. "The whole truth?" Emmett nodded warily. "I'm not doing this for you," Silas said. "Not entirely. I'm doing it for me." He saw Emmett's confusion and continued. "I spent 30 years taking homes from people. Some of them might have been bad businessmen, poor managers, whatever story I told myself. But they were still people. Still families, and I took their homes anyway, then sold the land to developers who turned it into strip malls and subdivisions and golf courses." He paused, feeling the weight of those years pressing down. "I can't give those people back what I took, can't undo the damage, but I can make sure you don't lose yours. And maybe if I do it right, if I help enough people, the scales will balance someday, or at least tip a little less heavily toward the wrong side." Emmett was quiet for a long time, absorbing this. "So we're your penance?" "No," Silas said firmly. "You're people who need help and will let me give it." "That's rarer than you'd think. Most folks I tried to help either turn me away because they know who I was, or they take everything and want more. You and Ruth, you just want what's yours. Your home, your dignity. That's all." "It doesn't feel right," Emmett said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Let me ask you something," Silas said. "If the situations were reversed, and you had the means to help someone rebuild, would you do it?" Emmett didn't hesitate. "Of course. Then extend me the same courtesy. Let me be useful. Let me do something that matters." Silas swung up into the saddle. "Besides, you're paying for it in sweat and effort. You're working as hard as any man half your age. That's worth more than money." He rode out before Emmett could respond, but he felt the older man's eyes on his back all the way to the property line. The work continued, faster now with additional hands. The barn was completed and passed inspection within a week. They'd started on the house foundation, which required careful work. The old foundation had been compromised by water damage and needed reinforcement before they could build on it. Jack supervised this part personally, unwilling to trust it to anyone else. Ruth's health seemed to improve with their progress. She had more energy, moved with less difficulty, and the color returned to her cheeks. But Silas noticed things the others might have missed. The way she'd pause sometimes, hand pressed to her chest, breathing carefully until the moment passed. The bottles of medication on the windowsill of the equipment shed, lined up like soldiers. The way Emmett watched her constantly, his concern a palpable thing. On a Thursday afternoon, Silas found Ruth sitting alone by the foundation, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She was staring at the ruins of the old house, and there was something in her expression that made him approach carefully. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She gestured to the ground beside her. "It's your time you'd be wasting." He settled down, his joints protesting slightly. They sat in silence for a while, both looking at the ruins. Finally, Ruth spoke. "I dream about her sometimes," she said softly. "Rebecca. In the dreams, she's still 7, still healthy. She's running through that house, laughing, calling for me. And I can hear her so clearly, Silas, like she's really there." Her voice caught. "Then I wake up and she's not. And she never will be again." Silas felt the ache of her words, the raw grief that time had scarred over but never truly healed. "I dream about Clara," he said. "Sometimes she's angry with me, asking why I wasted so many years on things that didn't matter. Other times she's just there, sitting beside me like we used to, and everything's peaceful. Those are harder somehow, because I wake up and have to remember all over again that she's gone." Ruth turned to look at him. "Does it get easier, the remembering?" "No," he said honestly. "But you get stronger at carrying it." She nodded slowly. "That's what I tell Emmett, that we're strong enough. But sometimes I wonder if I'm lying to him, if I'm lying to myself." She pressed a hand to her chest absently. "The doctor says my heart's giving out. Slowly but steadily. The medicine slows it down, but it doesn't stop it." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Does Emmett know?" "He knows it's serious." "He doesn't know how serious." Ruth's eyes returned to the ruins. "I haven't told him that the doctor gave me 2 years. Maybe 3 if I'm lucky. That was 6 months ago. Ruth, I need this house finished," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "I need to live in it again, even if it's just for a little while. I need to walk through those rooms and remember her. Need to show Emmett that we can survive anything, even this. Do you understand?" Silas understood. This wasn't about the house. It was about legacy, about leaving Emmett something to hold on to when she was gone. The house was proof that they'd rebuilt before, and he could rebuild again. It was hope made solid, love made permanent in wood and stone. "We'll finish it," he promised. "I swear to you we'll finish it." Ruth's hand found his and squeezed gently. "Thank you for understanding, for not trying to talk me into telling him. It's your truth to tell," Silas said. "When you're ready." They sat there as the afternoon aged into evening, 2 people bound by loss and the determination to create something lasting despite it. And Silas felt the weight of his promise settle onto his shoulders like a sacred trust. He would not let her down. Whatever it took, whatever favors he had to call in, whatever resources he had to spend, this house would be finished. It would stand. And Ruth would have her time in it, however long or short that time might be. Some things, he'd learned, were worth more than money, worth more than pride or independence or any of the things he'd once thought mattered. Some things were simply worth doing because they needed to be done, because another human being needed them done, because in the end, all we have is what we do for each other. The house would be finished. He'd see to it personally. The house took shape slowly, deliberately, like a living thing being coaxed back into existence. The foundation was reinforced and poured, smooth concrete replacing the crumbling stone that had held the original structure. Walls rose, straight and true, framed by Emmett's careful measurements and Jack's practiced eye. The electrical work was completed and inspected, passing on the first try, a fact that made Jack beam with pride at his apprentice. But as the work progressed, other things began to surface. Memories, mostly, released by the act of rebuilding. One afternoon, as they were installing the subflooring, Emmett stopped suddenly in the middle of the room that had been, and would be again, the living room. His hand rested on a floor joist, and his eyes had gone distant. "This is where her bed was," he said quietly, "when she got sick. We moved it down from her room upstairs because she couldn't manage the stairs. Right here." He tapped the joist. "I'd sit beside her every night reading to her. She loved stories about horses and far-off places. Said someday she'd travel the world." Ruth appeared in the doorway, carrying a box of nails. She saw Emmett's face and understood immediately. Setting down the box, she crossed to him and took his hand. "She was happy here," Ruth said softly, "even at the end. That's what matters." Silas and Jack exchanged glances and quietly moved their work to the other side of the house, giving the couple space to grieve and remember. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and Silas suspected it wouldn't be the last. The house wasn't just structure, it was a repository of memory, and rebuilding it meant excavating all those memories, both joyful and painful. Later that day, as they broke for lunch, a different truck pulled up, not the county man this time, but a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor. She introduced herself as Marion Fletcher, a lawyer from Billings. "I represent Frontier Development Corporation," she said, handing Emmett a business card. "They're the company interested in purchasing your property. I understand the county's timeline has been adjusted, shall we say. But my clients are still very interested in making a deal." Emmett's jaw set. "Property's not for sale. Mr. Walsh, please hear me out." Marion's tone was smooth, practiced. "Frontier is prepared to offer substantially more than the county's valuation. $200,000. That's more than enough to purchase a comfortable home in town, close to medical facilities." Her eyes flicked to Ruth. "I understand your wife has health concerns. Being closer to doctors might be beneficial." Silas felt anger spark in his chest. The implication was clear and cruel. They'd done their research, knew about Ruth's condition, and were using it as leverage. He started to speak, but Ruth beat him to it. "Young lady," Ruth said, her voice quiet but edged with steel, "I've lived on this land for 47 years. I raised my daughter here, buried her here. My health is my own concern, and it doesn't enter into decisions about my home. Now, my husband told you the property's not for sale. In my experience, when someone says no, the polite thing is to accept it and move along." Marion's professional smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes. "I understand emotions are high, but please consider, $200,000 is a generous offer. More than generous, really, given the condition of the property and your situation." "The situation is we're rebuilding," Silas said, his voice harder than he intended. "The property will be up to code within the deadline. There's no legal basis for forcing a sale." Marion turned her attention to him, and Silas saw recognition dawn. "Mr. Dunn, I've heard about you. Quite the reputation in land acquisition," she smiled. "I'm surprised to see you on this side of the negotiation." "People change," Silas said flatly. "Do they?" Marion's smile widened slightly. "Or do they just find different ways to work the same angles? Tell me, Mr. Dunn, what's your interest here? Surely you're not doing all this out of the goodness of your heart." The words hit harder than she probably intended, landing right on the raw nerve of Silas's own doubts. Was he really helping, or was this just another form of control? Another way of imposing his will, even if he told himself it was benevolent? But then Ruth stepped forward, placing herself between Marion and Silas. "His interest is that he's a friend," she said firmly. "And friends help each other. Something you might not understand, given your line of work." Marion's mask cracked slightly, showing irritation beneath. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm trying to help you." "No, you're trying to buy my land cheap, so your clients can make a profit. There's a difference." Ruth crossed her arms. "Now I've got work to do. So unless you plan to pick up a hammer and help, I'd appreciate it if you left." For a moment, Marion looked like she might argue. Then she collected herself, her professional demeanor snapping back into place. "The offer stands for 2 weeks. After that, Frontier will pursue other options." She handed Emmett another business card. "When you change your mind, and you will, call me." She left, her truck kicking up dust as it retreated down the road. In the silence that followed, Emmett tore up both business cards and let the pieces scatter in the wind. "Other options," he said darkly. "That sounds like a threat." "Probably is," Jack agreed. He'd been quiet during the exchange, but his expression was troubled. Development companies have ways of making things difficult. Not always legal, but hard to prove. Silas knew he was right. He'd seen it before, had even employed some of those tactics himself in his darker years. Suddenly discovered code violations, mysterious delays in permit approvals, equipment vandalized or materials going missing, a dozen small obstacles that individually seemed like bad luck, but collectively amounted to pressure. "We'll deal with whatever comes," Silas said. "Right now, let's focus on what we can control." The house. They returned to work, but the encounter had cast a shadow over the day. That evening, as Silas prepared to leave, Emmett pulled him aside. That woman, she was right about one thing, Emmett said. We probably should consider selling. Not to them, but eventually. This fight, it's taking a toll on Ruth. I can see it. Ruth wants to stay, Silas said. Ruth wants a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're all good for her. Emmett's face was drawn with worry. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish, trying to hold on to this place. Maybe it would be better to take whatever we can get and find something easier, closer to town. Less work. Silas thought about his conversation with Ruth, about the things she hadn't told her husband, about how much she needed this house, needed to prove they could rebuild, needed to leave Emmett with hope instead of despair. But it wasn't his secret to tell. Talk to Ruth, he said instead. Really talk to her. Ask her what she wants, not what's practical or easy, but what she actually wants. Emmett nodded slowly. Yeah, I will. But as Silas rode away that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running short. The house was coming together, but other forces were gathering. Marion Fletcher's visit wasn't just a courtesy call, it was reconnaissance. Frontier Development was planning something, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. He needed to work faster, needed to make sure the house was finished and the property secured before anyone could interfere. Because Ruth was right, some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Home was one of them, and Silas was done standing by while good people lost theirs. 3 days after Marion Fletcher's visit, Silas was examining the framing for the second floor when Jack approached with his phone in hand. His expression grave. We've got a problem, Jack said quietly, glancing toward where Emmett and Ruth were working on the porch. My supplier in Billings just called. Someone's been spreading rumors that this job's financed with dirty money. Now they're refusing to deliver the roofing materials we ordered. Silas felt cold settle in his gut. Who's spreading rumors? Wouldn't say directly, but he mentioned getting a visit from a lawyer representing Frontier Development. She implied that anyone doing business with this project might find themselves under scrutiny. Tax audits, permit reviews, that kind of thing. It was exactly the kind of pressure Silas had expected, but faster than he'd anticipated. Frontier wasn't playing around. They wanted this land and were willing to play dirty to get it. The irony of being on the receiving end of such tactics wasn't lost on him. We'll find another supplier, Silas said. Already tried. Word's gotten around. Jack's jaw was tight with frustration. It's not just the roofing. The plumber who was supposed to come next week canceled. So did the guy who was going to do the final electrical inspection. Silas swore under his breath. This was more than pressure. This was a coordinated effort to strangle the project. Without materials and licensed contractors, they couldn't meet the code requirements. And without meeting code, the county would have grounds to condemn the property. Regardless of any extension, he was trying to figure out their next move when another vehicle appeared, a sheriff's cruiser this time. Silas's stomach sank further. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Garrett, climbed out and approached with the resigned air of someone delivering bad news. Emmett, Ruth, he nodded to them, then turned to Silas. Mr. Dunn, I need to have a word. They gathered in the shade of the half-finished house. Garrett pulled out a paper, his expression uncomfortable. I got a warrant here to search the property. There's been an allegation of stolen materials. That's ridiculous, Emmett said immediately. Everything here was legitimately purchased or donated. I believe you, Garrett said, but I've still got to follow procedure. The complaint came from Frontier Development. They claim some lumber was taken from one of their other properties in the area. Silas felt the pieces click into place. This was the other option Marion Fletcher had mentioned. Frame them for theft. Create legal complications that would delay or derail the project. It was clever and completely ruthless. Go ahead and search, Silas said calmly. You won't find anything. Garrett conducted a thorough but professional search, clearly not enjoying his role in this theater. As expected, he found nothing. But as he was preparing to leave, he pulled Silas aside. Off the record, Garrett said quietly. Frontier's been making waves all over the county. They've got lawyers pressuring everyone, and they've made some generous donations to certain political campaigns. This isn't going to stop with one search warrant. What are you saying? I'm saying you're fighting a battle you might not win. Not because you're wrong, but because they've got more resources and they're not afraid to use them. Garrett's expression was sympathetic. I've known Emmett and Ruth for 20 years. Good people. But sometimes good people get steamrolled by companies with deep pockets and no conscience. After Garrett left, Silas found himself standing alone by the foundation, staring at the half-built house and feeling the weight of futility pressing down. They could finish the house, but if Frontier kept this up, they'd never get the inspections needed to make it legal. And without those inspections, the county would condemn it anyway. He was so lost in thought, he didn't hear Ruth approach until she spoke. We can stop, she said softly. If this is too much, if it's putting you in a bad position, we can stop. Silas turned to find her watching him with those hazel eyes that seemed to see everything. I made you a promise, he said. Promises can be broken when circumstances change. Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. This is becoming bigger than just rebuilding a house. That company, they're coming after you now too. I won't let you destroy yourself trying to save us. I'm not being destroyed, Silas said. But even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a worn photograph, edges soft with handling. She handed it to Silas. It showed a younger version of the Walsh homestead, pristine and proud, with a small girl sitting on the porch steps. Rebecca, her face bright with life and joy. That picture was taken 3 months before she died, Ruth said. She was so happy that day. We'd just finished painting the porch and she helped. Got more paint on herself than the wood, but she was so proud of it. Her voice caught slightly. When she got sick, when we knew she wasn't going to make it, you know what she worried about? She worried that we'd be sad, that we'd forget how to be happy. Silas looked at the photograph, at the little girl's smile, and felt something shift in his chest. On her last day, Ruth continued, she made us promise something. She said, Mama, Daddy, promise me you'll always be brave. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you small. She was 7 years old, and she understood something I'm still learning. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up even when you're terrified. She took the photograph back, held it against her heart. So no, Silas, we're not going to stop. Not because we're too stubborn to know when we're beaten, but because Rebecca taught us better than that. And because some things, home, dignity, the right to live where you choose, some things are worth fighting for. Silas felt his throat tighten. Here was this woman dying by inches, facing down a corporation that could buy and sell her property 100 times over, and she was the one offering courage to him. I need to tell you something, he said. The words came before he could reconsider them. About who I was, what I did. And then, standing in the shadow of the house they were building together, Silas told her all of it. Every ranch he'd acquired through pressure and manipulation. Every family he'd displaced. Every justification he'd used to sleep at night while destroying other people's lives. He told her about the Rodriguez family in Absaroki, about the widow in Red Lodge, about dozens of others he'd tried to help, but couldn't quite make it right because you can't undo the past. When he finished, Ruth was quiet for a long time. Silas braced himself for judgment, for the revelation to change how she saw him. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. I know, she said simply. Silas blinked. You know, I looked you up that first day after you left. Read about your business dealings, the ranches you acquired, your reputation. Ruth met his gaze directly. I know exactly who you were, Silas Dunn. The question I had to answer was whether I believed in who you're trying to become. And do you? I'm standing here, aren't I? A small smile touched her lips. People aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by whether they choose to stay in those moments or move beyond them. You chose to move. That takes more courage than never falling in the first place. Silas felt something crack open inside him, not breaking, but opening, like a seed splitting to let growth emerge. For 8 years, he'd been trying to earn redemption. To balance scales, he'd tipped so heavily toward the wrong side. But maybe redemption wasn't something you earned. Maybe it was something you accepted when someone offered it. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Ruth squeezed his arm gently. Now let's figure out how to beat these corporate vultures. Because I didn't survive losing my daughter and 47 years of frontier living just to let some suit with a briefcase steal my home. That evening, as the sun set and the workers departed, Silas sat with Emmett and Ruth and Jack around a makeshift table, discussing strategy. They couldn't stop Frontier's legal pressure, but they could work around it. Jack knew contractors in Wyoming who were outside Frontier's sphere of influence. Silas could source materials from suppliers in other states. It would cost more and take longer, but it was possible. As they talked, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but its close cousin, determination. These people had decided to fight, and by God, he'd fight with them. Not because it would redeem him, not because it would balance any cosmic scales, but because it was the right thing to do, and sometimes that was reason enough. The next 2 weeks became a race against time and resources. True to his word, Jack brought in contractors from Wyoming, men and women who either didn't know about Frontier's pressure campaign or didn't care. Materials arrived from suppliers in Idaho and North Dakota, trucked in at premium rates that Silas paid without complaint. The house rose faster now, driven by urgency and determination. But Frontier development wasn't idle either. First came the surprise inspection from the fire marshal, citing complaints about improper material storage. They passed, but it cost them half a day of work. Then the health department showed up, concerned about sewage disposal on the property. Also baseless, also time-consuming to resolve. Each inspection was legitimate on paper, but clearly orchestrated to slow their progress. The county deadline was now 12 days away. Emmett worked like a man possessed, often starting before dawn and continuing after dark by the light of portable lamps. Ruth tried to match his pace until Silas and Jack gently but firmly insisted she focus on coordination and lighter tasks. Her health had taken a visible turn. She moved slower, tired more easily, and Silas noticed Emmett checking on her more frequently. His worry etched deeper into his weathered face each day. On day 9, as they were installing the last of the interior walls, Ruth collapsed. One moment she was handing Emmett a level. The next she was on the ground, her face grey, her breathing shallow and rapid. Emmett was beside her instantly, calling her name, and Silas had his. Phone out before he consciously decided to move. The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive, an eternity, compressed into desperate moments of trying to keep Ruth conscious and comfortable while Emmett held her hand and told her to stay with him, to please stay with him. By the time the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, her breathing had stabilized, but she hadn't regained full consciousness. Emmett climbed in with her, his face a mask of controlled terror. "The house," he started to say, but Silas cut him off. "We'll handle the house. You take care of her." The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing, and Silas stood in the sudden silence feeling helpless and furious. This was his fault. He'd let them push too hard, had been so focused on meeting the deadline that he hadn't paid enough attention to the cost it was taking on Ruth's failing heart. Jack appeared beside him, his expression grim. "Not your fault," he said, reading Silas's thoughts. "She was determined. You couldn't have stopped her if you tried. I should have tried harder. Maybe. But Ruth's a grown woman who makes her own choices. We have to respect that, even when we don't like it." Silas turned to look at the house, so close to finished, yet still incomplete. The walls were up, the roof was on, the electrical and plumbing were installed. But the finish work remained: flooring, fixtures, painting, all the details that turn structure into home. And they had 8 days to complete it, get it inspected, and secure the final occupancy permit. Without Ruth, maybe without Emmett too, if she didn't recover. "We finish it," Silas said. "Whatever it takes." They worked through the night. Jack called in additional help, his apprentice Daniel, plus 2 more workers who owed Jack favors. Silas made calls of his own, mobilizing every resource he had. By morning, they had a crew of 8, all working with focused intensity. The house transformed before their eyes. Hardwood flooring went down in the living room, the same oak that had been there before. Kitchen cabinets were installed, handcrafted by a woodworker Jack knew. Bathroom fixtures, light switches, door handles, each element chosen to match the simple, honest aesthetic of the original house. This wasn't just rebuilding, it was restoration, honoring what had been while creating what would-be Emmett called on day 2 of Ruth's hospitalization. She was stable, he reported, but weak. The doctor said her heart had been pushed past its limits. They wanted to keep her for observation, possibly a week or more. And in his voice, Silas heard the thing Emmett wasn't saying, that it had been close, too close, and they were lucky she'd survived at all. "How's the house?" Emmett asked, and there was such longing in his voice that Silas felt it like a physical ache, coming together. "We'll have it ready." "Silas, I can't thank you enough." "Save it," Silas interrupted gently. "Just take care of her. Get her well. We'll take care of the rest." On day 5, with 72 hours left until the county deadline, Marion Fletcher appeared again. She stood at the property line, surveying their progress with calculating eyes. Silas walked out to meet her, his body language making it clear she wasn't welcome any closer. "Impressive work," Marion said, "though I notice several code requirements still outstanding. The final electrical inspection, for one. And I understand Mrs. Walsh has been indisposed. Without both owners present for the final walkthrough, I'm not sure the county will issue an occupancy permit." "We'll have everything ready," Silas said flatly. "Will you?" "Because Frontier is prepared to make a final offer. $300,000. More than this property's worth, even fully restored. And we'd cover Mrs. Walsh's medical expenses. All of them, for as long as necessary. It was a good offer. A generous offer, really. Enough to buy a house in town, close to medical facilities, with money left over for care and comfort. Enough to make life easier for 2 elderly people whose time was growing short. Any rational person would take it. But Silas had learned over these past weeks that some decisions transcended rationality. "The property's not for sale," he said. "Not now. Not for any price." Marion's professional mask slipped, showing irritation beneath. "Mr. Dunn, you're being remarkably stubborn about something that isn't even yours. Why? What possible interest do you have in this particular patch of land?" Silas looked past her, to the house that stood nearly complete, to the barn they'd restored, to the land where a little girl had once played and dreamed of traveling the world. "You wouldn't understand," he said simply. "Try me." He met her eyes directly. "It's home. Not mine, theirs. But that makes it worth protecting. Because in the end, that's all any of us really have. The places we belong. The places that hold our memories and our history. Take that away from someone, and you take away more than property. You take away part of who they are." Marion studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" "I do." She shook her head, more puzzled than angry now. "Then you're a fool. Frontier will win this. Maybe not today, but eventually. We always do." "Maybe," Silas acknowledged. "But you'll have to actually win it. We're not rolling over." After she left, Jack came to stand beside Silas. "That was well said, needed to be said. For my own sake as much as theirs." They returned to work with renewed purpose. The crew worked like a well-oiled machine now, each person knowing their role, anticipating what needed doing next. The house took on the feel of something cared for, something loved. Every nail driven, every board placed, every coat of paint applied, with the knowledge that this wasn't just construction, it was resurrection. On the morning of day 7, 48 hours before the deadline, Emmett called. "She wants to come home," he said. "Doctor says it's against medical advice, but Ruth's insisting. Says she needs to see the house, that she won't get better lying in a hospital bed staring at white walls." "Bring her home," Silas said without hesitation. "We'll be ready." That afternoon they did the final push. The last of the flooring went in. Light fixtures were hung. The front door, a solid oak piece that Jack had sourced from a salvage yard, period-appropriate and beautiful, was mounted and tested. Every switch was flipped, every faucet turned on, every detail checked and rechecked. At 4 in the afternoon they stood back and looked at what they'd created. The house stood complete, its white siding fresh and clean, its windows gleaming in the late sunlight. The porch where Rebecca had helped paint, where she'd sat for her photograph, had been faithfully reconstructed. Even the hardware on the doors matched the originals. Emmett had saved a box of old fixtures, and Jack had worked them into the new construction. It was beautiful. More than that, it was right. It honored what had been while embracing what was. A home reborn. The final inspections were scheduled for the next morning. Electrical, plumbing, structural, and the general building inspector, who would make the final determination on the occupancy permit. They'd know by noon whether all their work had been enough. That evening, as the sun set and painted the prairie gold and amber, Silas stood alone by the house and felt something settle in his chest. Win or lose tomorrow, they'd done this. They'd taken wreckage and made it whole. They'd stood up to pressure and intimidation and kept going. They'd proved that sometimes, despite everything, good people could build something lasting. He thought about Clara, about how she'd believed in him even when he didn't deserve it, about all the ranches he'd displaced, the homes he'd helped destroy, about the long road he'd walked, trying to make amends for sins that could never be fully paid for. This house wouldn't redeem him, wouldn't balance the scales. But it would stand, and that mattered. Ruth would come home to it, and that mattered. Emmett would have a place to remember his daughter and his wife when both were gone, and that mattered too. Sometimes, Silas thought, you couldn't fix the past, but you could build something good in the present. And if you were lucky, if you were very lucky, that was enough. Tomorrow would tell whether their luck would hold. The inspectors arrived at 9 in the morning, a convoy of 3 trucks. Silas recognized the lead inspector, a woman named Patricia Hernandez, who'd been in the business for 30 years and had a reputation for being thorough but fair. Behind her came the electrical inspector, the plumbing inspector, and a 4th man Silas didn't recognize, wearing a suit instead of work clothes. "That's County Commissioner Reeves," Jack murmured. "This just got political." Patricia approached with her clipboard, her expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Walsh, I understand you've completed reconstruction following the storm damage. We're here to conduct the final inspection for code compliance and occupancy permit." Emmett nodded, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He'd brought Ruth home an hour earlier, and she was resting in the equipment shed, insisting she'd be fine, but looking fragile as spun glass. "We're ready," he said. What followed was the most thorough inspection Silas had ever witnessed. Patricia went through every room, every wall, every corner with meticulous attention. She tested outlets, checked plumbing connections, examined the structural framing, measured clearances. The other inspectors were equally thorough, and all the while, Commissioner Reeves watched with hooded eyes and an unreadable expression. 2 hours passed. Then 3. The inspection stretched into the afternoon, each moment feeling like an eternity. Finally, Patricia and the other inspectors gathered on the front porch, comparing notes and discussing findings in low voices. Silas stood with Emmett, both of them silent, hardly daring to breathe. Patricia looked up from her clipboard. "Mr. Walsh, I'll be honest, I expected to find violations. There's been a lot of pressure from various sources to look extra carefully at this property." Silas felt his stomach drop. Here it came. The technicality they'd missed, the detail that would invalidate everything. "But," Patricia continued, and Silas heard Emmett's sharp intake of breath, "I can't find any. The work is exemplary. Better than code, actually. Whoever did this construction knew what they were doing and cared about doing it right." Jack let out a breath Silas hadn't realized he'd been holding. "So we pass." "The structure passes," Patricia said. "Electrical passes, plumbing passes. Everything meets or exceeds current code requirements." She glanced at Commissioner Reeves. "There's no grounds to deny the occupancy permit." Reeves stepped forward, his expression sour. "Ms. Hernandez, I think we need to consider—" "With respect, Commissioner, there's nothing to consider. The work meets code. The property is safe for occupancy. Unless you can point to a specific violation, my hands are tied." Patricia's voice was firm, professional, but Silas heard the steel underneath. She wasn't going to be pushed into denying a permit for political reasons. Reeves's jaw tightened. I'll need to review the inspection reports personally before any permit is issued. That's your prerogative, Patricia agreed. But the reports will show exactly what I just told you. This property is compliant. The standoff lasted a heartbeat longer. Then Reeves turned sharply and walked to his car without another word. Patricia watched him go, then turned back to Emmett with a slight smile. He'll try to delay issuing the permit, but he can't deny it. Not legally. You should have your paperwork within 48 hours. She extended her hand. Congratulations, Mr. Walsh. You have a beautiful home. Emmett shook her hand, and Silas saw tears gathering in the older man's eyes.
Thank you.
Thank you for being fair. Just doing my job. Patricia's expression softened. Though between you and me, I'm glad you made it. This land's been in your family too long to lose it to developers. After the inspectors left, the silence on the property felt almost sacred. They'd done it. Against all odds, against corporate pressure and political manipulation and time itself, they'd done it. The house stood, legal and complete, ready to be lived in again. Emmett walked slowly to the equipment shed. Through the window, Silas could see him kneeling beside Ruth's cot, could see her hand reaching up to touch his face. They spoke in voices too low to hear, but Silas could imagine the words. Promises kept, hope restored, home reclaimed. Jack clapped Silas on the shoulder. We did good work here. Yeah, Silas agreed. We did. What happens now? Frontier's not going to just give up? Probably not. But they've lost their legal pressure point. Without grounds to condemn the property, they can't force a sale. They can make offers, but Emmett and Ruth can refuse them. Simple as that. Nothing's ever simple when big money's involved. Silas couldn't argue with that. But for now, for this moment, they'd won. The house stood. Ruth was home. Emmett had his land. Whatever came next, they'd face from a position of strength instead of desperation. As if summoned by his thoughts, Emmett emerged from the shed, his face transformed. The worry lines were still there, the exhaustion too, but underneath was something new, or rather something restored. Hope, plain and simple hope. She wants to see it, he said. The house. She wants to walk through before the sun sets, Silas nodded. Then let's make that happen. They helped Ruth walk from the shed to the house, moving slowly, letting her set the pace. She was dressed in a simple blue dress, one Emmett said she'd worn on their 20th anniversary. Her hair was braided the way it always was, and despite her pallor and the careful way she moved, there was strength in her bearing, determination. At the foot of the porch steps, she paused, looking up at the house. The late afternoon sun caught the windows, making them glow like amber. The white siding gleamed. The oak door stood solid and welcoming. It looked like it had always been there, like the storm had never happened, like time itself had bent backward to restore what had been lost. It's beautiful, Ruth whispered. Emmett held her elbow as they climbed the 3 steps to the porch. She paused again, running her hand over the railing. This is where Rebecca sat for that picture. Right here. Her fingers traced the wood grain. I can almost see her, can almost hear her laughing. She'd be proud of you, Emmett said softly. Both of us. For not giving up. Ruth looked at him, and Silas saw something pass between them, a conversation of looks and touch that needed no words. Then she turned to Silas, who'd stayed back to give them space. Come inside with us, she said. Please, you're part of this too. They walked through the front door together, and Ruth stopped in the entryway, one hand pressed to her chest, her eyes taking in everything. The hardwood floors that gleamed in the evening light. The walls painted in soft cream, the same color they'd been before. The living room opening up to the right, spacious and full of possibility. The kitchen visible beyond, with its simple cabinets and wide windows. She moved through the rooms, slowly, touching walls, running her fingers along door frames, pausing in each space, as if listening to echoes only she could hear. In the living room, she stood in the spot where Rebecca's bed had been during those final days. I can feel her here, Ruth said quietly. Not like a ghost, but like love that soaked into the bones of this place and stayed. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Silas said, thinking of Clara, of how certain places still carried her presence, even though she was gone. They moved to the kitchen, where Ruth admired the cabinets Jack had crafted, the deep sink, the window over the counter that looked out toward the mountains. I always loved this view, she said. Every morning while I made breakfast, I'd look out at those mountains and feel grateful. Grateful for this land, for this home, for the life we'd built. She paused, steadying herself against the counter. Emmett moved to support her, but she waved him off gently. I'm all right. Just taking it in. Upstairs, the bedrooms were simple and clean, waiting to be furnished and lived in. Ruth walked into what had been Rebecca's room, smaller than the others, with a window facing east to catch the morning light. She'd sit right there, Ruth said, pointing to the window, and watch the sun come up. Said she wanted to be the first one to see each new day. Her voice cracked. She had so many days ahead of her. Should have had so many days. Emmett pulled her close, and they stood together in their daughter's room, grieving and remembering, the weight of loss and love mingling until they were indistinguishable from each other. Silas stayed in the doorway, bearing witness, understanding that some moments were too sacred to intrude upon, but too important not to witness. Finally, Ruth straightened, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she said, and Silas understood she was speaking to the house itself as much as to any person. Thank you for still being here, for waiting for us, for being strong enough to weather the storm and everything that came after. They descended the stairs carefully, Ruth's energy visibly waning. At the front door, she turned back for one last look at the interior, her eyes moving from room to room as if memorizing every detail. Home, she said simply. We're home. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, painting the prairie in shades of gold and copper. The barn stood solid and proud. The fencing that had been restored traced property lines with clean precision. Everything was as it should be, restored, renewed, reclaimed. Ruth settled onto the porch swing Emmett had hung that morning, a replica of the one that had been destroyed in the storm. She patted the seat beside her, and Emmett sat, his arm automatically going around her shoulders. They swayed gently, the chain creaking with familiar comfort. Silas started to excuse himself, to give them privacy, but Ruth stopped him with a gesture. Stay, she said. Watch the sunset with us. You've earned that much. So Silas leaned against the porch, railing, and watched the sun sink toward the mountains alongside. These two people who'd taught him more about courage and dignity than he'd learned in 7 decades of living. The light shifted and changed, painting the world in colors that had no names, and for a moment, just a moment, everything was perfect. The house stood. The land remained theirs. They were home, and that, Silas thought, was enough. 3 weeks later, Silas rode up to the Walsh homestead for what he'd decided would be his last visit. Not because he wanted to leave, but because it was time. The house was finished. The land was secure, and Emmett and Ruth had settled into a rhythm of daily life that no longer needed his presence. Patience picked her way carefully up the familiar path, and Silas found himself noticing details he'd been too busy to see before. Wildflowers had begun to bloom in the places where debris had been cleared. New grass was filling in the torn earth. Nature, like people, had remarkable resilience when given the chance to heal. He found Emmett working in a small garden plot beside the house, turning soil and setting out seedlings. The older man looked up at the sound of hooves, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. Silas. Good to see you. They shook hands, that firm grip that spoke of respect and understanding. Silas dismounted and tied Patience to the porch railing, where she immediately began investigating the new plants with gentle curiosity. How's Ruth? Silas asked. Good days and bad days, Emmett said, brushing dirt from his hands. But more good than bad lately. The doctor's amazed at her improvement, actually. Says being home has done more for her than all the medicine in the world. Home has a way of doing that. They walked to the house together, and Silas marveled again at how right it looked, how seamlessly it fit into the landscape, as if it had never been anything but whole. Inside, Ruth was sitting in a rocking chair by the living room window, a quilt across her lap, watching the mountains in the distance. She turned when they entered, her face lighting up. "Silas, I was hoping you'd come by." She set aside the quilt, a beautiful pattern of blues and greens that reminded Silas of Clara's work. "There's fresh coffee on the stove and pie cooling on the counter. Apple from the last of our preserved fruit." They settled around the kitchen table, the three of them, with coffee and pie and the comfortable silence of people who'd been through something profound together. Silas noticed small touches throughout the house, photographs on the walls, including the one of young Rebecca on the porch, a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, books stacked on a side table. The house wasn't just structure anymore. It was lived in. It was home. "We got a letter from Frontier Development," Emmett said after a while. "Final offer, $400,000. Silas raised his eyebrows. "That's substantial." "It is," Ruth agreed. "But we turned them down, told them the property's not for sale at any price." "How'd they take it?" "Not well," Emmett said with a slight smile. "But legally there's nothing they can do. Patricia Hernandez made sure our permits are airtight. And Commissioner Reeves, for all his bluster, knows he can't condemn a property that meets code. We heard he's under investigation now," Ruth added. "Something about accepting campaign donations in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. Funny how these things come out." Silas said nothing, but he remembered a few phone calls he'd made, a few documents he'd suggested certain people might want to look at. Sometimes he'd learned justice needed a gentle push in the right direction. They talked for a while longer, catching up on small things. The garden Emmett was planting, the quilting Ruth had returned to, the neighbors who'd stopped by to welcome them home. Normal, everyday things that somehow felt miraculous after everything they'd been through. Finally, as the afternoon aged toward evening, Silas stood. "I should be going. Let you folks enjoy your home in peace. You'll come back?" Ruth asked, and there was genuine hope in her voice. "This doesn't have to be goodbye." "I'll come back," Silas promised. "Just not as often. You don't need me hovering around anymore." Emmett walked him out to where Patience waited, Patient as her name. They stood together on the porch, looking out at the land that stretched away toward the mountains, at the barn that stood solid and true, at everything they'd fought for and preserved. "I've been thinking," Emmett said, "about what you told Ruth, about trying to balance scales you tipped years ago." "Yeah? I don't think that's how it works. Redemption, I mean." Emmett's voice was thoughtful. "You can't undo the past, can't really balance anything. But you can choose to do better going forward. And eventually, if you do it long enough, the good you do becomes who you are. Not compensation for who you were, but transformation into who you're becoming." Silas felt those words settle into him, gentle and true. "That's wise." Ruth said it first. "I just remembered it." Emmett extended his hand one more time. "Thank you, Silas, for everything. For seeing us when you could have ridden past. For staying when it got hard. For helping us reclaim not just our home, but our dignity. That's a debt we can never repay." "There's no debt," Silas said firmly, gripping Emmett's hand. "Just gratitude. You let me help, and that's worth more than you know." He swung up onto Patience and turned her toward the road. As he rode away, he looked back once and saw Ruth had joined Emmett on the porch. They stood together, his arm around her shoulders, watching him go. They raised their hands in farewell, and Silas returned the gesture. The ride home was peaceful, the Montana prairies stretching away in all directions under an endless sky. Silas thought about Clara, about all the ranches he'd displaced, about Ruth and Emmett and their daughter who'd died too young. He thought about houses built and lost and rebuilt, about storms that destroyed, and people who endured, about the long road from who he'd been to who he was becoming. He couldn't change the past, couldn't bring back the ranches he'd taken or restore the families he'd displaced. But he'd helped save one home, helped one couple reclaim their dignity in their land. And if Emmett was right, if redemption wasn't about balance, but about transformation, then maybe that was enough. Maybe he was enough. As the sun set behind him, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Silas Dunn rode toward whatever came next, carrying his past, but no longer burdened by it. He'd found something in that homestead, something he'd been seeking for 8 years, without knowing what it was. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but purpose. And for a man in the twilight of his life, that was the greatest gift of all.